Welcome back to the series on child trafficking and state abduction. In the first episode, I said I'd be continuing on with separating a child from a loving parent, but I'm not going to do that. I think we'll get to understand that in more detail once we have a greater understanding of the family court and how the child protection departments are operating. So in this episode, I'm going to go back to the beginning of my journey in this and how this all started. So I run a news site called Gumshoe News, and Mary Maxwell was investigating a cold case down in Adelaide. And she was writing about two siblings, Rachel Vaughan and Andrew McIntyre. So around September in 2018, I decided to go down there and put some interviews on film. And that is when I met the most wonderful and courageous Rachel Vaughan. And I have to thank her for her courage and showing us the way, showing us the light, and how this sexual abuse on children actually happens. And that began the process of learning. So I'm going to go first to a little snippet of an interview that I shot, just a short extract of what her father did to her and how he treated her.
Was horrific, and probably the worst repetitive nightmare that I have now is waking up there in my old bedroom. The abuses tended to occur when my mother was in hospital, or if she was away on holiday, or if she was working. I always knew never to get in the car with him. I tried my very best to avoid him. I spent a lot of my time with the chickens and the dog in the backyard, hiding in trees, hiding. I hid a lot. A lot of the time, shortly after the abuse would occur, my father would use a phrase that would help me to forget, and obviously I wanted to forget. No, I was a very busy child. I did a lot of sewing, I did a lot of making of things. I was very artistic. And the sexual abuse was it was so frequent. I suppose to a degree, I got used to it. I learnt other ways to cope with his sexual attentions where I wasn't getting raped as often.
It's quite traumatic listening to these accounts. Rachel describes these abuses in great detail, and it's hard to imagine what she must have suffered as a child. But we have to thank her for telling her story so that we can understand what other children today might be going through. And she's given quite a few interviews to across the world and to the International Tribunal of Natural Justice. She's described her accounts there. It was during the first weekend I was down there. She said, there's a little girl that I believe has suffered the same injury as I have. And she was referring to her father cutting her in the rectum with a knife. Now, in medical terms, this is a sphincterotomy and it is done for medical reasons. But in this instance, it's done to facilitate abuse and rape. So I'm going to play a short extract of the interview and how she describes what happened to her when she was still a very young girl.
Max came into my room one day. I remember I was wearing a little skirt. He came in and he was telling me about how we were going to play a game. Now, he had come into my bedroom and said things like that to me before, and I was terrified. So as he came and sat next to me on the bed, I kicked him away from me. He then fiddled around in his back pocket and he had a knife. It was a very oddly shaped knife, short little handle with a curved blade on it. And the blade wasn't sharp on the outside curve, it was sharp on the inside curve. He then held me around my waist so that my bottom was here, very, very tightly. I could not get away. I remember struggling. I then felt a searing pain on the inside to the left. He then pulled the knife out, undid his belt, undid his fly, and then raped me anally while I was bleeding.
It's difficult to imagine what some children have to go through. What distressed me was that I'd written several articles on Gumshoe News about this injury. Now, I'm in my 60s. I'd never heard of this injury before. And yet, what are the coincidences that Rachel, who disclosed this over 10 years ago, she wanted to confirm that the injury had happened. She wanted to have that in writing, so she went to a colorectal specialist, Dr. Nicholas Reiger, and he established that she had been assaulted as she described. And so when a little girl and then another young boy, when children 5, 6, 7, 8 years old describe knives being put up their bum and then bleeding, the one judge said, with regard to this, when this disclosure came up, the judge said, "Oh, that's just the most nonsensical thing I've heard." But as it turned out later, that there was more information that surfaced in another police interview later. Well, how could a little girl or a little boy invent such a story? And no one in authority believed them. No one in the authority even investigated it. Both these children were sent back to their abusers because they were not believed. It's just absolutely staggering. And we published this on Gumshoe News, and more people came forward. More protective parents came forward saying that their children had described this, and adults came forward and said this had been done to them when they were children. I did a survey in 2018, and in one of the questions, 14% of the responders, and there were about 70 people, protective parents who answered the survey, 14% said their children had suffered rectal bleeding. So how many children in Australia are keeping this secret? And in all these cases, the children were removed from the protective parent because the authorities did not believe the children. You cannot read these documents and say, no abuse happened. We are not going to investigate. There's only one other alternative, and that is they do believe the kid. They do know the kid is being abused. But the social workers or the psychologists or whoever, they've been instructed to not believe, to act against the best interests of the child, to conceal the evidence, to conceal the abuse. And in most cases, the children get reunified back with their abuser. And the child is alienated from the protective parent. Once a child is drawn into the web of sexual abuse, it is extremely difficult for that child to be extricated because there are many people acting against the best interests of the child. I'm now going to cover the different categories of pedophiles and those who enable them. And this is a broad spectrum and a cross-mix of people that either abuse the children or protect the behaviour. So we understand a classic pedophile is someone that gets sexual gratification with a child or a teenager. And a more general abuse is gaining gratification from controlling punishing, hurting, or making children feel powerless. And let me state here that I'm not gender specific here at all. There is the exploiter, that's a person who's gaining possibly financially from videoing or photographic exploitation. And then I've heard of parents, and both mothers and fathers, pimping out their children for money or for drugs or for whatever. The trafficker, there's usually money that changes hands in some way. CPS, Child Protection Services in America, is known as a big child trafficking operation, and this has been exposed. Government departments, kids become assets on the department books. Brokers get fees for placing children in foster care. So this is really people who are facilitating a child being removed from its rightful place, and when there's some form of money exchange. Enablers is a broad spectrum of people that allow the process to happen, that in some respects protects the abuse and the abuser. It's known that many psychologists have made a successful career enabling the system, writing bad reports, social workers making false statements, sending kids off to foster care, independent child lawyers ignoring what the children are saying. And in this group, there are infiltrators, people who are damaging to the protective parent, and they may be acting out of financial reasons. They may have been threatened to do so. It might be vengeance or blackmail. And we will cover the cultists, the people that belong to satanic cults, and we will try get interviews with people to explain this. And then there are the experimenters, the people that deal in medical experiments, MK Ultra experiments, mind control, the splitting of personalities. And I'm hoping Diane DeVere will come and explain that to us. She suffered that when she was a child in the UK. Then there's a large category of the blind, those that turn the other way, and consists of government ministers, the judiciary, that prefer to keep, as I say, the status quo going. They don't want to rock the boat. Then we get the deniers, and usually this is family. They're ashamed of the intrusion of pedophilia in their family, and they just want to move on from the abuse. They want to leave it behind. They want to kick the can down the road. But silence and suppression of their abuse is extremely damaging. It has lifelong consequences. So to all those social workers, police, children's lawyers, psychologists that are not believing the children, I think it doesn't make sense. It doesn't follow logic. So one has to consider that they actually do believe abuse happened. So they do believe the child, and they're concealing that belief, and that is a crime against the best interests of the child. And for those in denial who just say, well, maybe abuse happened, but we're just moving on. We've separated the child from the protective parent, or whatever the consequences may be. So one has to consider what the 8,000 victims of institutional abuse said to the Royal Commission. And they said that by people not believing, not listening, not acting when they were children, it left them with lifelong distress. And in Scott Morrison's national apology, he cited one case. He said,
and addictions followed. The pain didn't stop with adulthood. Relationships with partners and children became strained as survivors struggled with the conflicting currents within them. A survivor named Faye told the Royal Commission, "Nothing takes the memories away. It happened 53 years ago, and it's still affecting me." When a child spoke up, they weren't believed, and the crimes continued with impunity.
But the Royal Commission never went outside the remit of institutions. So there are thousands upon thousands of children that are suffering abuse across Australia. And right across the Western world, it seems that the child departments and the courts are acting in unison. and there seems to be a plan of breaking up family. So hopefully we'll start joining these dots as we go through the series. So I hope that you will return, subscribe, share, stick with us, and I'll see you next time.